Hi, everybody. My name is Carl Darden, and I'd like to welcome and thank all of you for joining us today here on Navy Sports Central. I am your host, and this is the official podcast of the Navy Sports Nation, where we take a deeper dive into Navy sports. In this episode, we'll get you caught up on a few of the fall sports going on right now. Two teams in particular are doing very well. And I'll also have an update for you on the Army-Navy Star Series. The mids aren't off to the greatest of starts, but it's still early, so there's no reason to push the panic button. And then get ready for a deep dive segment that was an absolute blast for me. We have a returning guest to the show, so we'll be talking about how things are going with his team and even do a review on a book that really shined a light on what's truly special about his sport. We'll get going shortly, so please don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. All right, so glad you could be here with us today on Navy Sports Central. Whether you are a returning listener or checking us out for the first time, thanks for making us part of your day. We are right in the thick of things as far as the fall sports season goes, and like I said in the opening, there are two teams in particular that are playing at a really high level. The first is the volleyball team. Now, last month they did drop a tough star match against Army on the road, but since then they haven't lost a single contest. I've seen them play a few times this year, and I can tell you that what I was seeing early on is if the team could tighten up their serving game a little bit and then take things up a notch in the last 5 points of each set, good things were just bound to happen, and that's exactly what we've seen. After that setback against the Black Knights, the mids have won 6 straight. Their power game is led by twin sisters Jamie and Jordan Llewellyn. Each of them have over 200 kills this year so far. Jordan has 225, and Jamie is right behind her with 211. And both of them are solid defenders, too. They currently rank 2nd and 3rd on the team in digs. Right now, the mids record is 7-1, and they are tied for first place in the Patriot League with Colgate. Now, if they can post the same strong record over the second half of the league schedule, they'll be in contention for the regular season championship. Next up, we have the men's rugby team. These guys continue to take care of business. I'll tell you what, over the last 2 games, they've absolutely demolished Air Force 71-0, and they followed that up with a 39-22 win over Penn State. Kind of an interesting story here. That win over the Falcons earned the mids the Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Shea Memorial Rugby Cup for the 5th straight year. Colonel Shea was an 89 grad from the Air Force Academy and a former rugby player who ended up going into the Marine Corps. He was also an assistant coach for the Navy rugby team at one point. And unfortunately, we lost him in Iraq in 2004. So that Memorial Cup that Navy and Air Force play for each year is a really nice tribute to an outstanding officer who had a great impact on both schools as well as the sport of rugby. And by the way, congratulations to the football team on that solid win over a pretty good Tulsa team. The mids were actually 4.5-point underdogs at home, but they played the way I knew they were capable of playing with that impressive 53-21 win. I'm not going to cover a lot of the details here because I have a pretty thorough breakdown of the game on the Navy Sports Nation group Facebook page. So you can check that out there. Now, if you haven't joined the group yet, please consider doing so. It's a great chance to interact with other Navy fans across all sports. By the way, the mids are currently 2-1 in the American Conference, and their next game will be a tough one Friday on the road against SMU. Now let me get you up to speed on the Army-Navy Star Series real fast. Unfortunately, the mids came up short in both men's soccer and golf this past weekend, so the Black Knights currently lead the competition 3-1. But the mids will have a chance to pull even if the men's and women's cross-country teams can win on Saturday. Historically, the fall sports are usually pretty even. Last year, the mids did win 6 of the 7 stars, but that's not the norm. Usually, the split is something like 4-3 in either school's favor. So we'll see how things play out this weekend. Also, the star in women's soccer is up for grabs. So actually, the mids can win the season if they can pull off a sweep of all 3 on Saturday. It's not going to be easy, though, because that soccer game is on the road, and it's kind of tough to win up there at West Point. By the way, if you want to catch that game, ESPN Plus will be streaming it beginning at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. All right, that pretty much does it for the sports updates I wanted to pass along. Our deep dive segment is next, and we will be welcoming back one of our special guests from last year. He's going to get us all caught up on what's been going on with his team, as well as how things are shaping up for this season. We'll be right back. Okay, it is time for our deep dive segment, and it's actually been almost 1 year to the day when I had the opportunity to visit with today's guest on my trip out to Annapolis, and I had the added bonus of observing him coach his team as I was preparing to do a feature on them for the Navy Sports Nation blog. By the way, I will put a link to that story in the show notes. So I am very happy to welcome Navy lightweight rowing coach Shawn Bagnall back to the podcast. All right, Coach, it sure is great having you back on the show. Thanks for taking the time to visit with us today.
Carl, absolutely. It is a pleasure every time I get the opportunity. So thanks for extending that again.
Absolutely. No problem at all. So when we spoke last year, we had a chance to get to know the Navy lightweight rowing program in pretty good detail. On this visit, I do want to kind of get into that a little bit more, but focusing more on the individual oarsmen and their responsibilities within the boat. You did a great job talking about what it takes to earn a seat, and that you use a time trial on the erg machine that essentially functions as the oarsman's resume.
Right, yeah.
And then based on how they perform with the other crew members, then you kind of decide, all right, what boat are they going to fit into and that sort of thing. So once they get to that point and you said, okay, I definitely want to have this person in either the number one boat, number two boat, number three, whatever, how do you decide which seat they occupy?
Sure. So I think, having coached at, having the opportunity and frankly, the pleasure to kind of coach at a couple different levels, whether that be the open weight women at the U23 level or heavyweight men, lightweight men. To your point, once you've kind of cleared the hurdle of deciding that these 8 individuals plus a coxswain are going to make up that 8,
right?
Sometimes you really are doing selection for particular seats. Obviously, we've come to know that the stroke seat is an extremely, important part of the boat. You need somebody tenacious, but somebody that has a good head about them, and they're not going to be easily flustered or try to do things on their own. Beyond that, I think that the rest of the boat, the way that I do it might be different than other coaches. I think in general, we tend to stick some of the stronger individuals to the middle of the boat, maybe allowing them a little less, responsibility, or not allowing, but just giving them a little less responsibility to how the boat is set, or, they can just kind of focus a little more on applying their strength to the boat. But I think every seat, I kind of tend to look at it, the seats closer to the stern with the 4 individuals in the stern 4 kind of setting a rhythm, and then you usually put your, more skilled athletes out on the bookends. So you'd have, not always, but sometimes you'll have scullers from high school that can really command the blades well and have a good sense of touch and feel.
Right.
They're great individuals for the bow pair or the stern pair. Having been a band nerd in high school, I appreciate the idea of rhythm a lot. So I tend to find, a stroke seat. I've told this story to other people that, I didn't know who the first year. I didn't know the individuals at Navy very well, just having got to the academy. So it was me learning about them. And really, I didn't decide on the stroke seat for the varsity 8 until, midway through winter training, where I kind of witnessed some of what these guys were doing. And this one person in particular, Tim Dixon, who's actually out flying, went Navy flight and is flying F-18s now. But but he just had a tremendous amount of rhythm in our workouts on land, and I just kind of surmised that he might be able to translate that out to the boat. But I would say then again, trying to establish rhythm in that stern pair, having someone in the 6th seat, which is going to be that 3rd seat back away from the coxswain in the stern of the boat. I rowed for a guy who was a multiple national, or didn't row for, coached with a guy at Gonzaga University who was a multiple national champion at Wisconsin. And he rowed a lot of 6th seat. He was arguably one of the strongest guys in the country while he was rowing in the 80s. And he always thought that, you needed somebody in the 6th seat who could pick up the rhythm of the stern pair and translate it back to the bow 6, which I do think there is a lot of merit to that. But I know this is a super generalization, and I'm sure if my athletes listen to this, they're going to give me grief. But, generally some of the rougher athletes, maybe they're strong, but maybe not entirely super slick on the water. You might place in kind of that 3 seat, 4 seat area, 5 seat. So again, they can kind of just focus on looking forward and matching. and just doing everything that they can to help kind of apply their physiology without being overburdened with rhythm or set or some of those other things. But
Right. Yeah, I get it. So essentially they're there because of the strength, and then any kind of technique improvements they have is kind of a bonus. Is that kind of how you look at it?
that is, yeah, very fair. And I think that we do see guys that are able to kind of make a jump from being, I can think of the now first class midshipman who's rowing, had rowed in the 2V last year that won the IRA. He kind of has made his way from sort of that 3 and 4 seat to more towards the stern, and has a great shot at being somewhere up in the stern of one of the top 2 boats again this year. So
Oh, very good. Yeah.
Yeah, just kind of an evolution of getting better, and
Right.
especially for
Right.
walk-on guys, just becoming more proficient in their rowing. So
And kind of along those lines, when you're talking about just steady improvement, one of the things I always look at is particularly in a sport like this, when you have essentially 8 individuals, working together, and you have a schedule of regattas coming up and that sort of thing. Obviously, the goal is to set things up so that the team is peaking at just the right time, right? So that they're performing at the highest possible level going into these big regattas. So I was kind of curious, when you're looking at available practice time and then the schedule that's out in front of you, how do you start putting together that strategy to figure out, okay, what do we need to be doing at different segments leading up to these regattas to make sure that the teams are ready to go?
sure, I don't pretend to sell myself as a physiologist, but I do understand enough to know that you can't have multiple kind of peak performance in your physiology. There's not a way for you to train and taper and perform and train and taper and perform and do that a bunch of times. So you do have to kind of set it up so that I think it's more coming to an understanding with the athletes that not every weekend is going to be fully tapered, and you're going to have your legs underneath you, and we're going to go light in the weight room, and and the volume is going to be a little less on the water, and we're going to get you all teed up to race. Sometimes you're going to have to race with a little fatigue in your legs. Sometimes you're going to have to train through some harder training sessions that we've put back to back. And, we tend to project that to the athletes through March and through April. That doesn't mean that, we take our cup racing any less seriously, because I think that is kind of the double-edged sword, is that you can't take it too lightly to the point where when the coaches are doing their seeding polls, so we all get seeded like NCAA basketball,
Right.
You're a 15 seed versus the 2 seed or whatever in basketball. Same thing happens at the Eastern Sprints, where the coaches get together. They essentially, everybody has a vote, and they do a polling. So you don't want to just totally train through and totally throw out the cup races, because again, you may end up on the bad side of a hard heat at the
Right.
at the sprints. But at the same time, you can't, like I said, you can't taper for every weekend. That's just not possible. So really just kind of taking into account how many sessions they have during the week. I think having to be, Navy is a place that is unlike, as unlike any other, in terms of not just the day-to-day rhythm for the midshipmen, but our river, the Severn can be notoriously bad.
Mhm.
We can go a week without really getting on the water much, other than in College Creek, and then have to pack up and go race at Penn, or pack up
Right.
and go race at Princeton, and those are, I think, building in the kind of mental resiliency with the athletes that, hey, look, so what? We might be indoors training for 2-3 days of a 5-day training week. That is not going to affect how you approach the racing or how well we're going to do.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I guess getting back to your original question, we tend to want to try to put our peak in somewhere around the Eastern Sprints.
Mhm.
That being said, obviously the IRA is a week or 2 weeks after, to include commissioning week that we have to kind of work around a little bit.
Right.
So
Right.
figuring out how to make sure they have a great race at the sprints, sets us up well for the IRA. And I think, especially this last year, we were able to do that. Certainly coming up short in a couple of races is a motivator for training the next couple of weeks
Mm-hmm.
heading into the IRA. So we weren't lacking motivation, that's for sure. And it was just a matter of, could we kind of let them catch their breath after the Eastern sprints, kind of fine tune, touch, dial in a few more things, and then just go and let it rip again. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right, good. Yeah, and I kind of wanted to say on that subject there, going into the IRAs, you had, and I saw the video from the Eastern sprints, and all three boats, number one varsity boat, number two, and then the fours looked really, really good. And I was wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about those three crews and what their strengths were. I just remember after the IRAs, you made a particular point of highlighting the performance of the number two varsity boat, just in terms of how it was able to perform all season long. So I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think back to this, back to the idea of motivation, or kind of touching on that last question. And that's something that James and I, my former assistant coach, were saying to the team. We used to go up to the sprints in the first few years that he and I were working together, where, our expectation levels were, let's just make the top 6 in every boat class, and now I think that the expectation is that we are giving ourselves the best opportunity possible going into the last 500 meters to win every event.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that takes a lot. I think it's unique to the Naval Academy in that we're able to field arguably one of the deepest teams in the Eastern sprints. But speaking to how that all evolved, we certainly came up a little short in the varsity 8. I think that margin between the 1V and the 2V was a grand total of 2 some odd seconds for both of those silver medals, which, again, when expectations are high and you have motivated athletes, 20 years from now, they'll all look back on that and think it was such an awesome achievement. And you know what? It is. And we made sure not to gloss over that. At the same time, I know that they were interested in kind of rectifying a little bit of that at the IRA. So, and then the third varsity 8, they did not have their best race. They came out of the blocks a little flat in the final. They had gone undefeated all year and finished 4th. And, I think that was certainly motivating for the 4 athletes in the coxswain that came out of that boat, the third varsity 8, to be in the varsity 4 at the IRA. So that's who comprised that boat. And I think you had four guys that were just extremely hungry. And they knew that they did not have a great race at the sprints. So they kind of wanted to come out and right some wrongs, if you will, in that varsity 4 race. But to your point in the 2V, I think they had such a heated battle with Columbia in that Eastern Sprints final that it was so close, and I think they knew they had a couple spots in that race where they could have, rectified some things. So it was just a joy to coach, because all 3 of those boats, and I'm sure James would say the same thing, you did not have to ask for more. You didn't have to ask them to pour on more. You didn't have to ask them to go to a much darker place, in the middle of the race, because they were willing to do it. And it really was just some great individuals, to include some really strong first tee leadership in that second varsity 8 that ended up winning. I think they were interested in getting on the other side of Columbia and certainly kind of making a statement. I think the 1V might have been the most challenging boat out of the, just in terms of their weekend at the IRA. They came out flat. They tried to, that's what I said to them after the heat. They tried not to qualify for the final. They tried their hardest, and despite that, they still managed to qualify. So I think they did the same thing they did in the fall, where they didn't have a great race at the head of the Charles, and it was a lot of dark introspection, I think, on a lot of their parts. And, I think they did a great job. And I have to compliment my team captain, Andy Labrie, who kind of kept everybody from spinning off the centrifuge, if you will, not keeping everybody tight. And, they went back to the hotel and recollected their thoughts. And I think they even, all 9 of them, went for a walk and just talked it out. And they knew they did not have a very good heat, and they knew that that was not representative of their speed. So I think when they came out, it was, let's be who we know we are, and let's race how we know we can. And you saw that, 1.9 seconds, like, away from a clean sweep would have been great. And at the same time, we go almost back to that Eastern Sprints moment where it's like, guys, you're down about the result right now, and it's going to sting for a while, but at some point you're going to look back and go, that was pretty awesome. And the fact that entire squad last year won, I think we counted up, including the Eastern Sprints and the IRA, it was something like 24 out of 26, or maybe that was a regular season, 24 out of 26 races, right, from 1V down to 6V, just a couple of blips here, I think, against Yale, and otherwise it was a historic year. It was great.
Yeah, because I was like watching the RAs unfold, and I said, okay, the fours won first, and in pretty convincing fashion, as I recall, and then the 2V8 boat comes through, and I'm thinking, okay, this is great if we can get a sweep like last year. So, I mean, I'm thinking right now, repeat national champions, So, and obviously that didn't happen because of the way that the IRAs are, and also the Eastern Sprints too, but the way that rowing is scored. Yeah. I was wondering if you can kind of talk a little bit about that and explain how, if Navy wins 2 out of the 3 big races, they still end up as runner-up for the national championship as a team.
Right. Yeah. It's probably not as interesting a point, kind of relative to everything else that we do, but the heavyweight league and the Eastern Sprints and lightweight league, we kind of, we operate somewhat independently, although we're all kind of under the Eastern Sprints umbrella in terms of a conference. But everything we do, we run through the conference commissioner, and his kind of mandate for us is that we are a unified front when we come up with decisions on what we're boating and what events are occurring at the IRA, and then how those events are scored. So, what ended up happening is that kind of pre-COVID, we had all made the decision, and I even wrote a proposal to have our model be almost a carbon copy of the women's NCAA model. So if you look at the women's national championships, it's first varsity 8, second varsity 8, and varsity 4. And I thought, what a better way to explain to an administrator or a lay person that's just like, well, how does this work? Be able to just point at the women's model and say, hey, lightweight rowing, we do the same thing. With that, we kind of came to an agreement on that, and that was how we were going to move forward. So we did move forward that first kind of COVID championship year, and then the following year, last year, everybody was back in the fold. And I think the one thing that, we ended up on the format deciding, but not the points. And so we came back and decided on the points, and back to this needing to be a unified front. Like I was of the opinion, and still am, that that 4 should count for something in terms of overall points. And I think everybody I talk to, that seems to make sense. I think that unfortunately we didn't come to a consensus as a league. There were some coaches, and I think the argument that I understand somewhat, but I think it can be a little bit of a kind of straw man argument. But they say, the argument against it is like, why we wouldn't want to score points towards an event where we may not have everybody having the ability to field that 4. So, for example, like if a Georgetown makes the IRA, they have a first varsity 8, second varsity 8, but they don't have a varsity 4. Are they in the overall points then somehow at a disadvantage? And I think the argument was that not every year, because that's technically not a national championship event, although it's at the national championship, that, administrators may not sign off on funding that. So I think that was some of the concern, was assigning points to an event where not everybody may be able to field the 4. So yeah, you're right. I mean, like I think plainly myself, I put that on us and myself, and we need to find 1.9 seconds somewhere. So we just don't have to worry about that. But at the same time, from parents to fans to supporters to alumni, it was kind of hard to, you scratched your head at it a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just did, it just is unfortunate because those guys in the four, I think, are as much a part of the national championship conversation and experience as the other two weights. So, yeah.
Yeah, it was. I did like the fact that they had their moment up on the stage and hoisted the trophy and all that kind of stuff, and I'm even willing to live with that if they could come up with a little bit more of an equitable tiebreaker. You know what I mean? Because the first thing I looked at when I saw that the second varsity boat won and then the first varsity boat came in second, the first thing I went to is time differential.
Sure.
I immediately looked at that and I said, man, I don't know how they're going to score this, but the mids win on that too. So, and then when I went back and saw how they did the Eastern Sprints thing, I'm thinking, oh my God, they're just like counting the same result twice.
Right. Yeah. So, and it just, the way the points structure works is, they, obviously the first varsity is weighted a little heavier. And you, if you saw a copy of because I know Row 2K, the rowing website usually puts that up, but kind of the points breakdown. So your 2V just isn't scored as heavily, so it counts for a little less. So I think that's kind of how that worked out. But
yeah. All right then. Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing how things play out through the fall and into the spring, and seeing if we can bring that trophy back, because even Columbia knows who the better team was.
Yeah, their guys would probably tell you it's something different, but we sure. We felt very good about the year, and I think Carl, the thing that we felt the best about both James and I was that the way we did it.
Yeah,
and I think what I mean by that is our guys were as gracious in winning as they were in losing last year. And especially when you're losing with that short a margin, I can tell you how immature I was as a 18 to 22 year old when I lost. I was not a good loser. And I can tell you that your listeners and anybody that's a fan of the programs at Hubbard would be really proud of how these guys conducted themselves and just who they are. And it just gets back to being how awesome it is to have any kind of part in the development of these athletes, both men and women, before they go off and do what they're going to do in the Marine Corps and out in the Navy. So it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, no doubt. So now let's go ahead and transition to this year and what you're seeing. I was wondering, it's funny. I kind of hesitate to ask this question because knowing how rowing is, where you're just basically working as a unit and you don't hear a lot of individual names getting thrown out there, but I did want to give you the opportunity to, especially for the guys that are coming back this year, if you could mention one or two that that really kind of help cement your team together, and what is it that makes them so critical to your team's success?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think that we were pretty fortunate to recruit a pretty talented freshman class they were plebes last year. So we're returning, that varsity 8 that did what they did last year had four plebes in it, which is pretty unheard of.
Yeah.
Especially given that there was a lot of, in our league and across the country, there was a lot of kind of COVID fifth years, extra year being given. So there was a lot of students that were taking advantage of that, and even the Ivy League kind of changed their rules a little bit. They don't ordinarily allow a fifth year, but they did for COVID. So we felt like we were up against it because we don't get a fifth year, our guys commission, and that's it. It's not like there's another year that they get.
Yeah.
So, but the guys returning, I think our stroke seat, Jackson Fuller, kid from Winter Park, Florida, just an outstanding stroke seat, very motivated, kind of type A, squared away, really takes everything we do. Even, we were at our strength and conditioning this morning in Wesley Brown in the weight room, and his lifting sequence or his strength training session may take a little longer, but that, he's doing like really thoughtful reps and he's making sure everything is done the right way. That also can cut both ways because he can be a tyrant up there in the stroke seat, which is to his teammates, which is okay. I'm very all right with that. But yeah, so the standards are high for him and with him, and I think that's good. But he, and again, these four plebe guys that were returning. The great thing is that 2V that won, there were some really talented walk-on guys in there. Matt Ross is one, first class that's returning, or he's a firstie this year, from Alaska, and never rode before the academy. His brother was a Marine, so I think that was some of the motivation to come to the Naval Academy, and he's looking to maybe follow his brother's footsteps that way. I mean, like in terms of raw talent, we're in a really good spot, and I think I think they understand that. I think the need to kind of harangue on them or goad them or pry them into wanting to work hard, like I said before about the racing last year, is almost non-existent. These guys are willing to go to those places and do the work that's required. And that makes practice kind of fun every day, because you just know they're willing to do what's necessary. And that includes the slower days, the more technical days and that sort of thing. But returning a good chunk of that 2V that won last year. And then a bulk of the varsity 8, I think that puts us in a good spot. And there's a couple of really promising plebes as well. So we're excited.
All right. Yeah. Good stuff. Now, you've also brought a couple of, or at least one new coach on board. Can you talk about him a little bit? Yeah.
So it's almost an entirely new, at least on the lightweight, in the middle boat bay at the boathouse, as we like to say, with the lightweight bay. Coach Sands, James Sands, moved along, headed out into the private sector, had some great opportunities there. And so obviously the guys miss him, and the team misses his presence and input. But I think it's something that he and I kind of would say to the team pretty often, which is, this is a kind of looking at your timeline of your life relative to the timeline of how long the Earth's been around and what a small blip it is, So, we talk about the oarsmen and their time, and the coxswains, their 4 years is a blip. On the entire spectrum of the team timeline, and that's kind of like a train. The train just continues to move. You get on the train, you get off the train, but in the same way an athlete may do that, a coach is going to do that as well. And whether that's somebody like Coach Clothier, who was on the heavyweight side for decades and decades, or somebody that has a quick and meaningful impact like Coach Sands. It happens. Turnover happens. So that being said, Coach Herrick, Dave Herrick, is a guy that I've really been lucky enough to continue to kind of follow his career, or been able to track his career a little bit. He came up to me at one point when he was an intern at Syracuse with the heavyweight men. And introduced himself. I really didn't know him because, he did row for my alma mater out at, or our alma mater out at Washington State, but just a talented athlete, grew up in Colorado, never had rowed before, walked on in college, and managed to do some really great things. I think he was a 2-time all Pac-10 or Pac-12 rower and 2-time captain of their team. So, anyhow, he went from the heavyweights there and followed him to his grad work and graduate assistant position at UVA with the women there, and obviously Coach Sauer and the women's program at UVA has always been very strong. So I think he learned a lot there, and then he was actually out at Oregon State with the women there, teaching their novices, doing a lot of their domestic recruiting. So all those things kind of fit the profile of what we kind of require and what we need here at the academy, because we don't recruit overseas, so that those talents aren't necessarily as utilized or as needed, I guess, here. But also teaching walk-ons how to row, teaching somebody who has never done it before how to do it. That's an extremely important talent, and I think Dave has that. So it's been awesome. If anybody follows the team on Instagram, I think James and I were maybe just a little bit too old to really, hone our skills on how to really run the gram. So
Right.
Dave, being a little younger, is taking that over, and I think everybody that follows it, will see that the content's certainly improved. So.
Right. Yeah, I get notifications pretty much daily on what's going on through Instagram. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and on a just a total other aside, we were lucky to have Lieutenant Tom Paul, who was a class of I think it was 2012, who came back. He was teaching. He was a coxswain for the lightweights at the academy, and he just retired from the Navy. And so we actually brought on another alum, Captain Ruth Fish, who's a captain of the Marine Corps, and she's teaching in the engineering department. But she's married to actually my first captain on the team, Seamus Fish. So pretty cool, small world thing, but brought her on as an O-rep. And so having her kind of history of the program and her experience as a coxswain with the team, I think has been great to have as well this year. So,
all right. I think we're going to go ahead and take a quick break here. This looks like a good stopping point. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Coach Shawn Bagnall, and he's going to give us his perspective on two of the greatest Varsity 8 crews that this country's ever seen. That's coming up next, so stay with us. Okay, we are ready to get into the second half of our Deep Dive segment here on Navy Sports Central. Carl Darden here with you, and I'm joined today by Shawn Bagnall, the coach of the Navy lightweight rowing team. Coach, there have been some terrific American crews that have competed on both the national and international stage over the years, and today I'd like to get your take on two of them. One of them was a crew known as the Miracle 9 from the University of Washington. They competed in the 1936 Olympics, and their story was told in the book The Boys in the Boat by Daniel James Brown. And by the way, I'm actually using his full name because this isn't the same guy who wrote the Da Vinci Code. Anyway, the other team I wanted you to talk about was from Navy. They earned the nickname the Great Eight and rowed in the Helsinki Games in 1952. So, Coach, you grew up in Washington and you rowed for Washington State, as you'd mentioned before. So you're pretty familiar with the Huskies program just because of having to compete against them.
Yeah.
And of course, coaching at Navy makes you uniquely qualified to kind of speak to what they've accomplished over the years. So when we first had a chance to meet, and I realized that you were from Washington, and then when you suggested that I read this book, I didn't want to miss the opportunity to ask you about both crews. So could you just share your impressions of them based on what you've learned going back to your college days? It's interesting because we're only talking about a difference of about 16 or so years, but the country and the world had changed so much because of World War II.
Sure. It's funny. Like I've talked a lot about Boys in the Boat to, kind of anybody that'll listen. Having grown up in Seattle, I didn't necessarily follow a ton of Husky rowing, although I was probably more enamored with and tracking, Don James and the Husky football team back when they were being pretty dominant in the late 80s and early 90s. And I was a ball sport guy, so I was playing football, basketball. My middle brother was rowing for Mount Baker, which is a club team on Lake Washington. So So I had cursory understanding of kind of the greatness of that program out there. But the one thing that was so great about that book and Boys in the Boat, for your listeners that have read it, they talk about just the era. My grandfather did some of his high school in Seattle, and then ended up working. He started off in the newspaper business, and that's what he did for his entire career. Actually retired in Spokane, Washington, with the Spokesman Review, which was the Chronicle before that. And in Seattle, Seattle Times, I think they refer to the original name in the book, or that maybe there was a merger between I can't remember how that worked. I should know because I delivered the Times and the PI in Seattle for a while as a little kid. But it was, I believe, the Seattle Star. And so that was the publication. And my grandfather was part of that publication while that boat and that crew was doing what they were doing.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that's what I remember. And I remember distinctly my grandfather telling me, not about the crew so much as it was, they talked about Hooverville in the book, and those were the tent cities during the Depression that were down kind of south of downtown Seattle. And, it was cool to read that book and connect those dots and just kind of have somebody in my life that actually had a connection to that period of time. But the thing that was just so striking, I think maybe if you were looking for a common thread between the boys in the boat and Rusty Callow and, the grade 8 at Navy, how many of those athletes were just strong, tall, athletic men who showed up on campus and learned how to row and went from just learning how to row somewhere in the Montlake Cut or out in Lake Washington to going overseas and racing in Nazi Germany, which was, again, you just can't get around the fact of what a cool story that is. But and as I mentioned to you before, the kind of connection with a great book like Boys in the Boat and, a book like Unbreakable about Louis Zamperini and essentially his story is just outstanding, phenomenal. And so anyhow, my growing up, again, was probably more circulating around football, but again, that story, is one that I think almost there's not a single person that I've recommended that book to that hasn't loved it. So I really enjoyed it. The only thing I was going to say is the reason that I love it is again, it is this very arguably kind of American story of these kind of hard scrabble and hard knock guys coming together at Washington and getting together and learning how to row and being a dominant crew. And but it paints such a great picture of our sport. And by great picture, I just mean, I think it gives just a very true and accurate representation of kind of what it takes to not just physically be good, but mentally like those men were. So, yeah. And, the one thing I picked up on too, and I remember years ago when I was just, the last squadron I was in on active duty. This is going to sound a little bit off topic, but you'll get where I'm going. We did this sketch for a change of command, and one of the guys, is actually a classmate of mine from school. We were in the same squadron. He goes, "Hey, Carl, can you like carry a tune? Can you sing a little bit?" And I said, "Well." I said I was in a choir when I was 8 years old, but long story short, we did like a little mini musical thing where we sang a couple of songs a cappella. My classmate Bud Sickler took the lead during our practice sessions because he was in a glee club at the academy, and he says it's very, very important to understand how you sound with the group of people that you're singing with. How you fit in, right? So, and I remember them making this reference in The Boys in the Boat as well. It was the Mr. Pocock who made the boats. He was talking to Joe Rance, and he was like saying you got to be able to trust the people that you're rowing with, and you have to understand how to row with them, right? It's one thing to be technically sound, but another to kind of fit in with the rhythm of the crew. So that was the one thing that I really kind of picked up on and made a lot of sense to me. I really appreciated that, because now we're not just talking about yanking an oar through the water, right? We're talking about just being able to achieve some sort of rhythm. And the more successful you are in doing that, the more effortless it becomes for everybody. Yeah, absolutely. I think that the most important point there for me in listening to you tell that story about reading that was maybe one of the other great things about that book is just kind of the window into a guy who is so huge in our sport in George Pocock, and Stan Pocock and the whole Pocock family, but just having someone that, as you said, and maybe even as a coach, you can be a great technician and teach the stroke well and teach guys to be mentally strong when they're pushing hard on the erg or out on the water or whatever. But really, there are some things that are nuanced, very kind of almost, to your point, kind of a greater than just even the sport. And I think that's a talent that Pocock had, was to be able to talk to these men and kind of almost kind of bring their their it's not understanding, but kind of their level of thought of what they were doing to kind of this next level, and not just that they were big strong guys and they were all putting their oars in together and pulling them out together, but that there was a whole other level of what they had to do in order to go over and win the Olympics. But never mind that, just go out and compete with Cal every year in their dual racing. So
okay, so there's some background on the Miracle 9 from Washington. Now let's go ahead and talk about the Great 8 from Navy. I remember seeing that YouTube does have an interesting documentary on them. It's about an hour long that really introduced me to it. And I thought it was very well done. Narrated by Gregory Peck, as a matter of fact, who was a rower himself, I guess, at Cal, at least for the time that he was there. But what can you tell us about that crew?
That group, that is one of those kind of mythical groups that you learn more about, I would say, when you start coaching at Navy. I actually watched that same documentary on VHS in our erg room at Washington State about the Great 8.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, 1995 or 6.
Yep, that's right.
I'm watching this VHS about a crew that I don't know anything about. But I mean, again, another story of just a crew that, when you go undefeated for 3 years and you don't lose a race, and it's, again, largely done by athletes who had never rowed before, who, to your point, learn how to work together really well, learn how to kind of find these connections that are almost above and beyond what they're doing physically in the boat, but just almost of the same mind in the boat. Those guys, I mean, it's pretty historic to have that kind of a run. We were lucky enough at the 150th banquet for Navy rowing to have Frank Shakespeare, who was the bow seat of that boat. He was one of the guest speakers, and and there is a handful of those athletes and those men still around, although some have passed. And when that does happen, we've been, again, connected and lucky enough to take, there's a heavyweight 8 that's the Great 8, which is an endowed shell in the boathouse, and anytime one of those members has passed, we've been able to take that over to the columbarium if they're being
what a nice touch that is.
Yeah, buried over at the columbarium or buried at the Naval Academy cemetery, and have that boat out there for the family to see. And just, again, I think we talk about with the lightweight guys, certainly, and I have no doubt Coach Friedrich talks about it, and Coach Schlossberg as well on our women's side, but just how we walk in the footsteps of these giants,
Sure.
and it really is, to hear someone like Frank Shakespeare, bow seat of that group, speak at the banquet. I mean, he was hands down the best speaker, no offense to all the other great alumni that got up and spoke, but he was the one that got up and I think said the poignant things that only can come from somebody with that kind of perspective. So our indoor rowing tank is named for that group.
Yeah.
One of the members actually had one of the oars that they raced with at the Helsinki Olympics that ended up coming back to the United States, and now it's mounted up in that tank room in the Hubbard Hall Boathouse. So it's pretty awesome. And I know that some of your listeners may know we had 3 crews from Navy represent the U.S. at the Olympics in 1920, 1960, and then clearly this crew in 52. But I think this really was the one that set it apart because it was kind of a little bit later, just in terms of rowing. It wasn't in the 1920s. It was certainly moving into a different era of the sport. And,
right.
Again, I think we're pretty privileged to be able to kind of work and coach at a place that has kind of history like that.
Yeah. And real quickly, I mean, just talking about that track record again, undefeated for 3 years. So basically that means 3 IRA championships, 3 Eastern sprints at the very minimum.
Yeah.
I think they even picked up a Western sprint championship as well.
Yeah.
And 29 straight races. So as I'm learning about all of this, I'm thinking to myself, how in the world are they managing their way through all these injuries that have to be coming up at some point? I mean, when it comes to rowing, what are some of the most nagging injuries that are really tough to shake off?
Sure. And I'm sure that in an era that they rowed in, we clearly are fortunate to row in an era where there's probably a little more medical advancement and a little more, sure. athletic training. And so, we definitely have the resources that maybe they didn't. They probably just rubbed a little dirt on it. put some dirt on it and got back out there. But even last year, one of the guys in the varsity 8 for us had a rib injury, and for rowing, as much force as you're putting on your rib cage, and kind of, your spine certainly, but I think more often what we see with overuse is going to be the repetitive motion and the stress on the rib cage and the cartilage. And so even, when I was lucky enough to coach with the U23 women, we would see that they would come off their season with NCAAs and they jump right into kind of this high volume and selection with the under 23 group. So the rib itself, can certainly get stress fractures and that kind of thing, but you can definitely do some damage to the cartilage there too, intercostal muscles, right, and that sort of thing. So we deal with that, and really that's the tough thing about the sport is, like, with the back, you might be able to get heat and stim, and you might be able to do some kind of hydrotherapy or maybe even chiropractor and that kind of thing. But with a rib, it's rest.
Yeah.
And not at the collegiate level, but certainly at the U23 level, having athletes race with kind of steroidal patches on their ribs just to try to get through the world championships. I think whatever guys can do, and I think by the time they get to that time in the year, and this is where this rib popped up for us last year, was between Eastern Sprints and the IRA. Just them understanding that, hey, I just need to be super attentive to my recovery and my stretching and everything else I can be doing, icing. But the reality is that I'm down to my last couple of weeks, and then I'm going to have this longer break for summer training and get to go do ProTrimid or whatever it was that he was off to do. But ribs. We do see some a little bit of, you can get some compartmental syndrome in the forearms. So get fluid kind of irritation there with the tendons and that sort of thing. So you get some fluid buildup and get some creaking in the wrists and forearms. That's not great either. But I would say generally the ribs are usually the most common in my experience. And then from there, it's just, little things from there. So could those athletes in 52 to 54 or 48 to 52, could those guys have been experiencing that? Certainly. I think that as you've seen the technology improve in the boats as well, certainly they're lighter and the oars are lighter. Everything's just kind of lighter. But I think there's also an ability for us to, if you're not smart as a coach, over-rig them or make them too heavy, and then that can also induce some of those things. So you have to know what you're working with, what the strength is of your crew, and be able to kind of rig the boat accordingly to ensure that you're not overstressing them, but you're giving them enough grip on the race course. So
Right. Okay. I have one more question as it relates to the two crews we've been discussing, specific to the Olympics that they competed in, because when I read The Boys in the Boat and then I looked at the documentary, there were so many similarities between, when you look at the backdrop of each of these stories, right? You have the 1936 Olympics, the Depression is still kind of gripping the country. And then, of course, you're dealing with Nazi Germany over there just within 3 years of starting the next World War. And, of course, they want to use the Olympics as this huge propaganda tool. So in the run-up to the games, they are basically creating a false impression of what their country is really like.
Yeah.
And the book does a pretty good job of discussing this in detail. So there's that. And then you look at the 1952 Olympics where, okay, we're several years removed from the war ending, but just launching into the Cold War. And not a whole lot of people know about the Russians because the 1952 Olympics was actually their first Olympics following World War II. So I'm looking at all the tension that exists here, and now I'm trying to figure out which story I think is the most compelling. And Coach, this is going to sound like a cop-out, but I didn't have an answer. I mean, both of them were equally strong, especially when you look at what the Miracle 9 crew had to deal with in the finals. I mean, they were stuck in the most unfavorable lane despite having the most dominant performance in the heats. And then you've got the Grade 8 going against the Russian crew that was pretty much a mystery to everyone. I mean, they were housed in a different location from the Olympic Village. And of course, fears of communism were running pretty high in the United States. The one thing that the Americans did pick up from the Russians during the heats is that they like to get up to a maximum stroke rate as fast as possible and just hang on in an effort to wear down the competition. So, Coach, I would like to get your perspective on this. When you look at both of these crews, including their Olympic experience, does one story kind of stand out over the other, or is it pretty much a coin flip?
Myself being a history buff, it's always interesting to kind of look at the past, because I think it informs, or at least gives you some insight in the present. I think another common thread you could say about both of those crews is that there were no international athletes in there. This is not my opportunity to harangue on programs that recruit internationally just because we can't,
right?
But we can, and
right.
and so I think we are tasked with creating the fastest boats possible with the best talent in the United States. And again, in both cases, you had two Olympic crews, but both Olympic crews comprised of all U.S. citizens and guys that grew up in the U.S., and especially in the case of the Navy guys wanting to serve. I think that is a unique thread between those two crews. Not to say that you couldn't have, in this day and age, like the US 8 is clearly the US 8. They just got done racing the World Cup, which is kind of one of the normal regattas that are run every year at Worlds. So the World Cup just concluded, and obviously all the U.S. athletes are United States citizens and all that. But that being said, in this day and age, you'd be hard pressed to find any of those crews, either on the lightweight side or the heavyweight side, that were in the grand final at the IRA last year that don't have a good number of international athletes from across the world. Right. So it just, in both cases, so unique that those athletes rode for U.S. institutions in Washington and the Naval Academy, and they all were from the United States, and they all then went on to represent the United States on the world stage. To your point, I'd be hard pressed to try to pick one over the other. I love the story of the boys in boat, because it wasn't like they were just in the ramp up and leading to them winning trials and going to Germany. It wasn't as if they had won everything under the sun leading up to that.
That's right. Yeah, they had to battle.
That's right. And so, a little different than the Navy crew experience in that grade 8, where those guys were just dominant, which is an awesome story in and of itself. But it would be interesting, somebody like Dan Brown to turn around and write a book about the grade 8.
Right.
Somebody does kind of a deep dive like that with that crew. And I think you alluded to it in an email with me, but just about how, essentially, they're not essentially, they are with George Clooney and his production company doing a movie, like a legit Hollywood movie. It would be cool to kind of see the same thing with the Helsinki group in the grade 8.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah.
How cool would that be? And any great publicity for our sport would be awesome. But yeah.
Yeah, that would be pretty awesome. Okay, Coach, I've got one more question for you before we wrap things up. And it has to do with what the members of both these teams accomplished after their time in the boat was over. It's pretty impressive stuff. And I have to think it's due in part to the sport that they chose. So I just wanted to get your take on, and you certainly can speak to your background as well as an oarsman. What are some of the things that you've pulled away from rowing that has really benefited you since you've stopped competing, and even outside of coaching, right? Just your day-to-day or professionally, or however you want to look at it.
Yeah. I honestly think that sometimes it's harder to articulate the answer to that. How familiar you are with yourself. I think, I had an assistant coach, or a volunteer assistant at one point, helping me with freshman crews that I was coaching. And his line to the freshman guys was like, you'll learn something about yourself every single time you sit down and do something hard on the erg or out on the water. You learn something about yourself. And I do think that I was a mediocre basketball player. I was a short-lived football player in high school. And just the thing about rowing that I think it was as honest a thing athletically as I had ever done. And I think the fact that there is so much constant feedback, there's not just from a coaching, but just your own kind of, when you're on the ergometer and you've got the monitor in front of you, that's a truth meter. It's speaking to the output now, and again, now that I'm not rowing anymore, really, when I sit down on the erg, I've got to have a little humility at what that monitor is telling me. But at the same time, like, I think the lessons that we feel like we try to have the mids fully embrace while they're in the moment, because I think they can all, you name a historical Navy rower from Alan Shepard to Admiral Richardson or anyone else. I think they'll all tell you in retrospect, like, yeah, it's more informative than a lot of the stuff I was doing in the brigade or even in my classes and all that. I think in the moment, being able to appreciate that and have them be able to scratch their head and go, oh, yeah, like I did just learn that lesson about leadership because I did this, or I chose to look for this opportunity to lead in the locker room, or being resilient. I think that is also one of those things. I mean, you read that and gosh, some of those stories in Boys in the Boat, like the fact that I think it was Rance that was left
Joe
on
Rance.
left on his doorstep. Parents just drove off. And
Yes.
Good luck. Clearly, our mids are not dealing with that here at the academy, but at the same time, I do think it is teaching them to be resilient. When the Severn's bad, or you have a bad practice, or you have a bad piece, a piece on the erg, if you're doing a test piece, how do you handle that? I do think it really forces you to examine yourself. If we go to this kind of know thyself, I think that helps, and maybe I'm overstating it, but I really do feel like it is helpful for these athletes, being young officers, when they head off into the fleet, to be able to kind of tap back into those experiences to help be better leaders with their enlisted guys. And if we're tasked with something, it's that. And, in my experience, like, clearly I've never led soldiers or led enlisted, but, at the same time, like, I do think that it's when I've had setbacks in my life, or I've been faced with really tough moments, again, there's a place you can go to where you can say, I was there at the Eastern sprints and we were behind and I worked really hard, and then I ended up winning the IRA in the next 2 weeks. And so with that tough moment of losing by 1 point whatever seconds, like, I can internalize that, harness it, use it, fuel me to something greater, 2 weeks later, or 2 years later, or 2 decades later. I really do think it teaches these men and women at the boathouse how to just be resilient. And I do think there is a lot of our society that appeals to kind of, how do we make life easier for ourselves, or the easiest for ourselves? Having these athletes walk away and say, I don't need the easy route. It's nice if I have it, right, but I don't need it to succeed, and I can become better, improve each day. I'm down at the boathouse, and it's just that confidence that I think it instills in them to again leave the academy, know that they went to one of the most challenging schools in the country. They walked away with a great degree, but then they also had this outstanding 4 years as an oarsman or a coxswain or oarswoman or coxswain, and I know it's a point of pride for all of our graduates. So, yeah.
All right. Yeah, that was very well said. I don't think I could have put that any better. Yeah, that's going to take us to the end of our conversation, Coach. Once again, thank you so much for joining me in this discussion, especially talking about the book and the 2 crews. So good luck the rest of the season. I'll certainly be following you guys on Instagram. Is there any other place that's good to follow the team on besides Instagram, or is that the primary one?
That anymore, I think that's kind of the go-to, and just in terms of just quick information and that sort of thing. Obviously, the navysports.com, you can find the drop down for our team there. But those are the two big ones. And I think, anytime your listeners are out and about or in Annapolis and have either listened to these podcasts or read Boys in the Boat, like, that's always great, is to have somebody that has no connection even to Navy or to the academy just be on campus for a wedding, and they walk in the front door and, like, wow, this is okay. So is this, and they'll say this, is this like Boys in the Boat? It's like, absolutely. It's like Boys in the Boat. So, you take them up to the trophy room and you show them some of the history and again, like I say, any chance we get to get out in front of that kind of stuff is an awesome opportunity, including sitting down and talking with you, Carl. So,
Well, I appreciate that. And certainly I can totally vouch for what Coach Bagnall just said, because when I was out there last fall, and you're hearing it from somebody who actually went to the academy and only walked into Herbert Hall one time while he was there. But then last year, Coach Bagnall took me on a great tour and learned even more about the historic, just the history behind the building itself and everybody that's walked through there. I can tell you that I feel the same way about history as you do. And when we were on that tour, there was a bit of a calming, peaceful feeling that came over me as we were kind of walking through the bays and the wave tank and everything, and just having you explain everything to me, looking at trophies that were 100 years old. I mean, to me, that just blew me away. Yeah. So I really appreciated that. So I highly recommend that to anybody out there who's listening. And if you're within shouting distance of Annapolis, try to get yourself over to Hubbard Hall, because it's a really cool experience.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Coach. I really appreciate it. And we'll be tracking you guys throughout the rest of the fall and into the spring. And good luck the rest of the season.
Yes, sir. Carl, again, thank you so much.
All right. You take care. Okay. Coming up next, we have our question of the day and mid-watch segment. So stick around. We'll be right back. All right, now it is time for our question of the day. Let's go ahead and check out the responses to the one from our last show. And as you may remember, it had to do with the Navy passing game, and here it was. Vince Terrell Jr. had 114 receiving yards on 3 catches in Navy's win over East Carolina. When was the last season the Mids had a player gain over 100 receiving yards? So the choices were A, the 2016 season, B, 2017, C, 2018, or D, 2019. And I also mentioned that there was bonus points for naming the player and the opponent. Now, the most popular answer was 2016, with 54% of you going with that one. Next was 2019 with 27%, followed by 2017 with 18%. The 2018 season didn't get any votes, which I guess is understandable because that was a pretty rough year for our quarterbacks. Anyway, the correct answer was 2019, and it was in the third game of the season, which also happened to be against East Carolina. C.J. Williams caught 3 passes from Malcolm Perry for 117 yards. 2 of them went for touchdowns, including an 80-yard score, and Navy won the game 42-10. Now, what's interesting is that in that awful 2018 season, the Mids actually had 2 players with over 100 receiving yards in a game. C.J. Williams was one of them. He had 104 receiving yards in a win over Lehigh. Later in the year, Taylor Jackson had 5 catches for 120 yards in a loss to Houston, and one of those was a 50-yard touchdown pass. And by the way, Garrett Lewis was the quarterback in both of those games. Okay, now let's get to this week's question. Since 1952, the U.S. men's 8 crew has won 3 more gold medals at the Olympics. So the question is, how many years went by between that second and third gold medal? Was it A, 32 years, B, 40 years, C, 48 years, or D, 52 years? I'll go ahead and put the question up on the Navy Sports Nation group Facebook page later today. And you can also respond by email. That address is carld@navysportsnation.com. All right, I tell you what, we're going to wrap things up by moving right into our mid-watch segment. So let's go ahead and see how things are tracking with Ellie Abraham from the women's cross-country team. The Mids were up in South Bend, Indiana on the weekend of September 30th to compete in the Joe Piane Invitational. That was their final tune-up before the big dual meet coming up against Army this weekend. Anyway, Abraham finished among the top 7 Navy runners with a time of 17 minutes 35 seconds over the 5K course. Now, 3 of the top 7 Navy runners finished within 5 seconds of each other, which is exactly what you want in a cross-country meet. Because remember, the goal is to have as many of your top 7 runners finishing together as high as possible overall. And the more that come in the top 10, the better chance the team has of winning. So the Mids are setting themselves up pretty well for that big meet coming up against Army this weekend. Next, we have Keegan Shreves, the captain of the men's golf team. And as you heard me mention earlier, the Mids weren't able to make it back-to-back stars against Army this past weekend. But the previous week at the Folds of Honor Collegiate Invitational up in Michigan, Shreves was the second Navy finisher behind Owen Huntington, and he shot his best round of the tournament on the final day. The Mids finished 13th in a highly competitive 18-team field. And by the way, the weather conditions up there in Michigan were really lousy. The golfers had to deal with a lot of rain, and temperatures were in the low 50s for much of the last round. So the team has 2 more tournaments this season. One started yesterday, as a matter of fact, and that's the Jackson T. Stevens Cup down in Juno Beach, Florida. After that, the Mids close out their year with the ODU OBX Intercollegiate at Powell's Point, North Carolina, and that starts on October 23rd. That's going to do it for this edition of Navy Sports Central. Thank you all so much for joining us. Now, if you like what you've heard, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and remember to spread the word to all the other Navy fans out there. Once again, I'd like to thank Navy lightweight rowing coach Shawn Bagnall for spending some time with us today to talk a little bit about his team and the upcoming season, and for giving us his perspective on the University of Washington's Miracle 9, as well as the Grade 8 crew from Navy. We have been getting a great response to our question of the day, so if you want to jump in on that, just go to the Navy Sports Nation group Facebook page. I will go ahead and pin it to the top so you won't miss it. And just a quick reminder, the views expressed on Navy Sports Central are my own and do not reflect those of the U.S. Naval Academy or Navy Athletics. By the way, the music used in Navy Sports Central comes to you courtesy of Audio Jungle. This is a great site for purchasing the rights to use music from thousands of artists around the world, and those we feature in the podcast will be credited in our show notes. Talk to you soon, everybody. Until next time, this is Carl Darden. Go Navy, beat Army.